Alright, we finally have Sony's typical Year 3 Slim Model PlayStation revision for PS5. We've got two consoles here, so we'll do a quick unboxing, but then also some general size comparisons. Also mess around with those two disk drives, see what's going on there, and try to answer some general questions about the hardware if you're curious about picking up this machine this holiday season. Now, right off the top, I just want to do a quick size comparison of the actual product boxes, because I'm sure most of you already know. I mean, the OG PS5 is ridiculous. You know, the console's huge, and that extends to the product box that it comes in. So, I mean, just off this alone, you can kind of get a good idea of this is certainly a smaller model. But also looking at other product boxes, this one, still pretty big. PlayStation 4 was obviously a small machine for its time. Same deal there. PS4 Pro, a little bit bigger there, right? So taller, but in terms of depth, a bit shorter. PlayStation 3 was a very big console for its time, the original fat model, and the boxes here are actually a very similar footprint. It's uncanny, actually, when you look at how big these two are compared to each other. They're about the same. Series Xbox, still much smaller than this thing. Again, a little bit thicker, but kind of a moot point. In fact, a lot of the Xbox boxes have always been fairly similar in size, right? So you've got Xbox One right there. You've got a 360 arcade right here. But enough of that, let's get this guy opened. Power cable. There's your two little horizontal feet right off the top. HDMI 2.1 compliant cable. USB-C to USB-C. Another white DualSense controller. Sony's had some very minimal packaging efforts for the entire PlayStation 5 cycle. That still extends to this machine right here, so it's really a no-frills experience. Of course, this is a Spider-Man 2 bundle, so we have a code for Spider-Man 2. And some more paperwork for PlayStation 5. Now, I would have liked to get the vertical stand for you all today, but unfortunately, Sony's not fulfilling those to retailers, so you do have to order those online. Alright, there is our new PlayStation 5 model, also known as CFI 2015, because in the eyes of Sony, as I like to remind people, they don't ever really change the console name. It's always just PS3, 4, 5, right? That's how they always do this. The Slim term is always a fan moniker, which, I mean, it's not like it's wrong. Every time we get a Slim console, it's usually a pretty big difference, and so that's the argument with this thing, is that it's not small enough to, you know, be considered a PS5 Slim. First impressions, I find that, yeah, I think it's small enough. Maybe it's just on the cusp of, like, where it's like, all right, should we really be calling this thing Slim? I think it's fine. It is small enough, but we'll get into some comparisons in a second here. But otherwise, this is it, which it is interesting because on retailer listings, even on PlayStation.com, they will use the word Slim there, just to let people know, hey, this is the updated model, since most folks are probably not going to be that privy to looking for the 2015 model number, but otherwise it's still fairly obvious given the product images for this new machine. Now, in terms of the physical differences, the new PS5 is a little bit shorter, lighter, the overall volume has been reduced. It's simply a smaller PlayStation 5. When we look at other parts of it, the rear I/O, mostly the same, just the HDMI and the LAN port are to the left side of the USB-A ports, but you've still got two back there. The front, you're exchanging a USB-A for two USB-C now, so slight change there. The overall design, that's where it's a bit different. I find it's actually much more similar than what we've seen with prior PlayStation revisions for that standard Slim console, right? I mean, we've seen dramatic changes going from PS2 to the Slim, to the PS3, PS3 Slim, so on and so forth. The same sort of design characteristics carry over, like the PS2 ridge design or the PlayStation 3's same basic shape and profile moving over to that Slim, although the Super Slim is much different. Same for the PS4, right, with that sort sort of horizontal slant, sort of stacked appearance. It's the same deal here. It's just that I find they're very similar, and maybe that is to some level for a lot of folks, maybe playing into the whole it's not nearly as slim as we have seen prior, although that is definitely true as well. It's not nearly as small as we typically get. But again, I still find it small enough. It is subjective though. So, I mean, I've always actually liked the old PlayStation 5 design. I kind of buy into the whole, contemporary design language that Sony's going for, where it's meant to look very futuristic and make a statement, right? There's, no denying that this is a PS5 in your house. This, much the same. I don't necessarily care for this more aggressive, swoopy line where it seems like they're just trying to save space for the sake of it, right? Whereas it's less pronounced on the old machine. I'm not bothered by the upper glossy panels on the top of the machine either. That is something where it's reminiscent of the early PlayStation 4 models. Now, the problem with these is that they can attract fingerprints. They're very susceptible to micro scratches. Something where if you get this thing, just try not to touch it often, put it down, and it'll stay mostly clean. And at least because it is white, if you do stick with the white panels, then it's not going to show that stuff nearly as much. Black is a real problem with that stuff usually, with glossy plastic. But I actually don't mind it. I think it looks fine. Good, I would even say. But I still prefer the old one when we're talking about the appearance of the new machine. Okay, let's start with the console covers. We do know that Sony is going to offer additional colors for the new machine, and all 4 panels can come off just as easy, if not more easy, than the old machine, where, it was a little finicky, right? You'd have to pull from one corner, then push in one direction, that's how it comes off. This one, at the very least, it's easy to remember, so if you want to access the fan assembly or your M.2 drive, that's this top panel right here. And the clips are all facing the same direction. So it's something where they're facing towards you if the front of the PS5 is facing away from you. So you would pull from every front angle of the console. It's not from a corner this time. You just do a little pry right there, comes right off, and there is your fan assembly. Same deal too, so you can use some security screws and easily pull out the entire assembly, clean that. There's your M.2 drive. And then if you want to access the detachable disk drive, same thing. Pull from the front, comes right off. And with the disk drive, it really is so simple. So it's not even so much a latch. You simply just tuck in your finger and lift up, because that's where the connector is. This is where it meets right here. And if you want to hook it back in, just make sure you slot it from this point forward. Makes a solid connection. It is very simple, so if you ever have to access this thing, swap it out or upgrade from digital to a disk machine, that's how simple it is. And sort of the same thing backwards, just slot in from that end and then push down, you are good to go. And that's going to be the same for the back of the console as well when you inevitably change out the colors. Now let's experiment with the detachable disk drives. During the initial PS5 setup process, if you choose to ignore connecting online, you are going to get prompts and warnings about needing to register the disk drive. It will not work without doing this. And just to confirm, the drive will refuse to accept disks, it just does not work. When you do connect online, it's mandatory that you update the firmware, which in this case, this particular console shipped with version 23.01 07.40. That firmware went live back in June of 2023. Once you do take on the latest system software, the drive itself will update, and then you can use it, and you will be able to use it offline without a PSN login. Now, if you do happen to reset your console and you're also offline, you'll get a warning that you won't be able to unregister your disk drive from that PS5. I did a reset offline anyway, with a disk still inside. Once I was back on the home screen from a factory reset, the console reported back a disk that is not supported, since it was already inserted. But if you do connect online, do a system restart, which is always required for pairing a disk drive, then there's no errors. You just do the standard register process, even though I did not unregister the drive beforehand. And since a disk was already in there, it was immediately read and began installing. Now, if you start up that console with the disk drive disconnected, then nothing happens. No warnings, no prompts. It just operates normally and will even ask for a disk for software that needs it. So that tells us the system software running on the new 2000 series doesn't make any distinction of a disk console or not. If you remove the drive, you've just got a digital edition PS5, one without the side panel technically. Now, what happens if you take a registered disk drive and plug that into another console that already has its own registered drive? Not a whole lot. The register and unregister process, for all intents and purposes, is a very basic online handshake. So it just lets you register the drive immediately, overwriting the previous console. So while the online requirement is a pain and a serious detriment to preservation for these drives long term, at the very least, they are extremely interchangeable. It's just a shame that resetting a console unpairs a drive. Sony is likely in a position where they're being proactively compliant with DMCA lobbying, since it's typically a requirement for an online check-in when Blu-ray drives are changed or serviced in a manner where there's a daughter board on the drive that is changed. And since this is a detachable drive, albeit in a manner that we don't often see where it's very modular, and it's in Sony's interest anyway to block third-party drives, this is the end result. In theory, the online check-in should only be there for Blu-ray movie playback and not games. I would have liked to see this be available so that in 20 or so years, we're not potentially looking at a bunch of e-waste, because Sony is no longer offering a network that lets you pair these millions of drives. But for now, this is what we've got. Alright, so the stand situation. We're very familiar with how the original PS5 comes with this sort of funny but, convenient horizontal or vertical stand with this rotating mechanism you would screw in from the bottom if you're doing vertical, and every PlayStation 5 came with this. Mine's actually broken. It broke at some point last year. I don't even know when that happened, but that's always been an option from day one. The new console, Sony is saying, hey, if you want a vertical stand, that's going to run you $30. They're not throwing that into the box, which quite honestly, I think it looks nice. I wish I had one to take a look at right now, but since this console isn't nearly as top heavy as the old one, with how it's just, it sort of bellows outward a little bit, and this is more bottom heavy, you really don't need it, although it would be great to have some rubberized feet so that way it's not easily sliding around as much. But the horizontal stand are basically these two little, plasticky bits. They slot into the side of the console. I don't really get the problem with these. I think they're convenient, easy, and they stay in there. It's a solid connection. It's not like, I assume most people are not moving their PlayStation 5s around all the time, but I tend to do that simply as a byproduct of this channel. And the old stand is such a mess. Every time I need to move this console or change an HDMI port or something like that, it almost always sort of falls out because I keep it in a horizontal position. So this, thus far, is solid. It works. It's low profile. I don't see the problem. I think it's, it's fine. If you do happen to lose one of these, at least they're small and there's going to be probably a good aftermarket for replacing these, much like this console has already. Alright, as far as tearing down the new model goes, this was pretty straightforward. Now, full disclosure, I'm more of a casual hobbyist in this area. To me, this seemed much easier to get apart compared to the CFI 1015 models, but for someone who works on these all the time, they might feel differently about this new one. It is nice to see access to the CR2032 battery. You do have to basically remove the entire plastic chassis, but you don't have to remove the shroud from the motherboard. If it has to be replaced, you can do it from here. Taking off that shroud though, there's still plenty of thermal pads making contact on the memory, SSD, capacitors. Between that and the heatsink location and how the heat pipes run through, it's a familiar design that thus far just gets smaller and smaller. Naturally, it's smaller in this case because the console is physically smaller for the first time, and that's where we recently learned that, yes, they're still using liquid metal, APU die size is still a 6nm process, and that means power consumption is the same too. So what this tells me at least is that as far as PS5's thermals go, the company probably has some telemetry that has given them the okay that they can reduce the console size without needing to change too much else. It goes back to that controversy surrounding that first revision. Sony probably had a lot of overhead when it came to suitable operating temps for this console, so the more data they have, they will cost down bill of materials as they see fit. That's not necessarily a bad thing for this console, it just means that it might be a little bit longer until another revision comes that moves the process size over and we see some efficiency gains. And this does extend around other areas of the console. fit and finish isn't bad, but it's just a standard slimmed down console that we normally see from Sony and other platform holders too. There's just certain parts and angles where it might look cheaper or feel cheaper, and that is true because that's the entire point of this console. Get the pricing down for Sony so they can make a little bit more money. Or, at least in this marketplace, try and sustain the margins they do have. Okay, noise tests. We'll be doing this in a reasonably controlled way. The noise floor in this room, with it being as quiet as it can be, is under 30 decibels. Here's some comparisons for reading a disc. Unmistakably, the slim model is louder, and the tone is much different too. It's something where I find the difference is larger in person than the few decibel difference the reading shows. Next is testing for coil whine. Most PS5s out there will have this. Let's see if the new one does too. We'll be running Demon Souls, switching between performance and fidelity mode. It's hard to make out, but the slim consoles will still produce a very slight buzzing noise from the power supply, though it's much less pronounced when comparing it to the 1015A. The trade-off, however, is that the slim does have a more noticeable fan whir that's louder than the 1015A, which in a way mutes out the coil whine. But let me attest that you have to basically get your ear right up to the slim in person to hear the coil whine. Unless you're incredibly sensitive to this kind of noise, I can't imagine most are going to hear it, versus the old model where a lot of people can pick up on it, which can be louder when you've got a fan type that's not as loud. So there's a serious trade-off here to consider when it comes to your sensitivity for noise. Now let's cover up a few other miscellaneous items here. This new model comes with a 1TB SSD, and for those curious on how much of that is usable, it's 848GB, up from the 667 on the current models, so you can easily fit a few more small games, or one big one. The detachable drive does still have an emergency release. If the drive is not working, there's an open hole that reveals a screw. You can thread that and eject a disk manually. The LED status indicator on the new model is more pronounced on the left side now, near the disk drive. From a top-down angle, it almost seems like it's not even using most of the strip, but it's the brightest from the left and fades out to the right. Also, a really nice external change that I forgot to mention earlier is the separation of the power and eject buttons, eject being right next to the drive. So now you always know the middle button on the glossy black panel, that's power. And just to throw in a real-world use case where the size made a difference, this is my living room, and I could never put a PS5 down here because there wasn't much room for a vertical orientation. It would hit my TV, and horizontal would really be pushing it since my soundbar eats up most of the room on the TV stand. It's quite long, and so on the far left, there is a spot, but a standard PS5, it looks really silly there. It eats up the entire area. You can't really fit the cords behind the console, but the Slim, it does fit well enough, and it actually is something where I can now keep a PS5 down here. That is everything so far for the PlayStation 5 Slim. We will of course do more long-term testing over time, and we'll probably have more coverage coming up fairly soon in relation to the console, but you know, there's only so much we can do within a 24-hour period. But hopefully you found something in here that was useful, and thank you so much for watching. So I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.